Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Graunt Kruger. I'm an executive director at Intellidex, and I look after the strategy and market research practices in our company. I also manage the United States office for our business. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very interesting and important launch of the report on social impact bonds in South Africa. This report analyzes the implementation of the first two social impact bonds, also known as SIBs, and both of these were launched in 2018 and ended in 2020. The first of these SIBs, also known as the Bond for Jobs, is an was provided by employment services to unemployed and marginalized youth. The second, also called the Impact Bond Innovation Fund, or the IBIF. This is a SIB that delivered early learning services to vulnerable preschool children and their caregivers in their homes. In a few minutes, my colleague, Dr. Zoheb will provide more detail about each of these SIBs, and he will give you quite a bit of detail and quite a bit of the background. But for the time being, let me just give you a brief summary of what they both are. SIBs, in a nutshell, are innovative finance instruments that are based on collaborative pay-by-results governance mechanisms to ensure effective social welfare services. That's quite a mouthful. So essentially, innovative financial services that are intended to help deliver effective social welfare services. Today, we have people from very different spheres and backgrounds on the webinar. We've got investors, we've got community organizations, we've got people from government, we've got lawyers, we've got philanthropists. And I think that just shows us the nature and complexity of what we're dealing with when we're talking about social impact bonds. I don't want the word complexity to frighten anyone off. I think when we are having the discussion later with the panelists, and these are people who've been involved with the social impact bonds directly, we should all emerge from our conversation today maybe a little bit more informed, with a few more questions answered, and potentially some new areas for us to learn and explore together. From the outset, we would gratefully like to acknowledge the financial support of Standard Bank Tutuwa Community Foundation that helped us to create these reports. While the foundation is also an investor in both bonds, the creation of this report and the investment reports on each of the SIBs was completely independently done by Intellidex. So it goes without saying, but the views expressed in these reports are ours as Intellidex and not that of our funders or any other participants in the research. The report that we're going to be discussing today looks at the social impact bonds broadly in South Africa, and there are two other reports that will go into more detail about each of the SIBs. We are going to be exploring this narrative or the issue around social impact bonds broadly because we think that there is an important conversation to be had about SIBs as future financing tools that may help us bring about social impact, and also to understand what future they have in South Africa now that we've had the ability to actually reflect on two of the SIBs that have already run. So all three reports will be available on our website during the course of this presentation or this launch, and will certainly be available to you on the website after the launch as well. After my introductory remarks, Dr. Zoheb Khan, who has been working very closely on these reports, will go through the research in detail. He will explain how we went about the study, what the major findings were. After that presentation from Dr. Khan, we'll move into a panel discussion with some of the SIB participants, and we've really tried to bring the cross spectrum of all of the folks that were involved in the two SIBs that we've analyzed. And then we'll close today's conversation with some closing remarks from Zanele Twala, who is the CEO of the Standard Bank Tutuwa Community Foundation. From your perspective, I hope this is going to be an engaging and interesting session for you. We would love you to participate. Please post any questions you have in the Q&A section. It should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring those, and the moderators are on standby to collect any questions that you put forward in the Q&A. They will bring them to our attention, and we will then be able to present those questions to the folks who are either on the panel, or you can also ask questions to Zoheb when he does his presentation. So please feel free, use that Q&A section at the bottom, and we'll be able to grab your questions from there. So let me just introduce you. That slide that you're seeing there, that's me on the far left. I've already introduced myself. I've spoken about Dr. Zoheb Khan. He is our social economy research manager at Intellidex and the lead investigator on this particular project. And then Zanele Twala, the CEO of Standard Bank, who's going to be doing our closing remarks at the end of the webinar today. We are delighted to have 6 panelists on our webinar today, and you'll see them on the slide now. We'll say hello to them in just a little bit, but let me just go through them as we have them there from left to right. So you'll meet him in a bit as well. Joseph De Silvio from Volta Capital is joining us. Nazim Hendricks from the Jobs Fund. Nafisa Rabini from the Western Cape Foundation for Community Work. Justin Przeski from Standard Bank Tutuwa Community Foundation is also joining us. Katsuri Soni from the Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator is coming on the panel with us. And then TJ Tapela from Brimstone Investment Corporation will be joining us too. So you can see already from those panelists, what we are aiming to do here is have a broad conversation to get an understanding from all of those different participants on these SIBs, from their experience directly, and what they've seen, what lessons they've learned, and give us guidance and ideas of how these instruments could be used in the future. That panel also reflects broadly what we've come to call the spectrum of capital in Intellidex. We have picked up the spectrum of capital from the G8 Task Force on Impact Investments, and perhaps some of you are familiar with that. From an Intellidex point of view, we've always worked across that spectrum. So whether it's on the far left with traditional investors who tended, I'll qualify that by saying have in the past, sought financial returns as their primary objective. And on the far right, whether you have your philanthropists or your donors who have sought as their primary objective social outcomes. We are starting to see, and we've seen across many of our projects in Intellidex, that even with these two diverse stakeholders or sources of capital, the questions are starting to blend into each other, where your traditional investors are really starting to ask questions about social impact and sustainable investments, or maybe even broadly ESG for environment, social, and governance issues. And then by the same token, on the other side of the spectrum, our philanthropy clients have been asking questions about impact investments. How do they use their assets and their endowments to put those assets behind their social mission? So how could they invest differently from how they've done in the past? And today's conversation on the social impact bonds is one of those moments where all of these various sources of capital across that spectrum are coming together. So from an Intellidex point of view, we've seen these conversations happen in many different projects. With the SIB, the chickens have really come home to roost because all of these conversations are happening in one project. That's really going to be what we're going to be getting into and exploring how those various sources of capital have worked together and collaborated on these social impact bonds. As I mentioned earlier, and you can see on the slide now, the 3 reports are available for you on intellidex.co.za/reports. The first 2 on the left are the reports looking specifically at the bond for jobs, and the second one looking specifically at the SIB that was launched to support early childhood education. And then the final one on the far right is really the report that we're using as the focus for today's conversation, which explores how the work in these SIBs have now influenced the thinking in South Africa around the deployment of capital and various sources of capital to reach important social outcomes for the country. Just a little bit of background on some of these SIBs. We know that in 2010 already, the first social impact bonds were launched in the UK. Today, there are from our research, about 150 in almost 30 countries worldwide. The first bond that was launched in an emerging market was in Colombia, and that was focused on maybe sort of similarly to the bond for jobs in South Africa, looking at how to create jobs for vulnerable people and how to bring to them employability training. Similarly, then in South Africa, we've had the Bond for Jobs that launched in 2018. And then shortly after that, we had the Impact Bond Innovation Fund, or IBIF, that was launched to bring efficacy to home-based early learning programs for pre-primary school age children. So I think that's an important thing to remember, is that the early childhood education intervention in that bond was for pre-primary school children. So these reports are available for you, and I hope you'll make the time to read them. And certainly, we are looking forward to having you and bringing your questions to the conversation today. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Zoheb Khan, to take us through some of the research and the research findings and give us some of his insights that he's been able to pick up from that research. Over to you, Zoheb. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for making the time to be here today. We started this research roughly a year ago, and it's been a long and often difficult process. So it's a great pleasure for me to share our findings with you today. And I hope that you engage with the reports, and also during the launch now, just feel free to ask us questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Yeah, so I was the lead author on these 3 reports, and we used a case study methodology to get an understanding of the 2 SIBs that was as complete as possible. Our data collection involved collating and analyzing all publicly available documentation about the 2 SIBs, as well as formal interviews with 80 participants in these SIBs. And those go right across all the different categories that you see on the screen now. And those include the investors, NGO staff, outcome funders, but also the beneficiaries of the services. And before I go into more detail about what exactly social impact bonds are, I'd just like to say thank you to a few people. So firstly, to Zanele Twala and to Pumla Hobeyabo at the Tutuwa Foundation. So they financed this work, but they provided a lot more support than just financial, and I thank them both for that. Also, thank you to all of our 80 interviewees who made the time for us, talk to us in a lot of detail about their experience of participating. And most of these were done during lockdown, but I'm sure we all kind of dealing with difficult new reality and possibly had better things to do. So thank you for that. And then finally, the research team at Intellidex. Thank you for all your help. So Tim, Ernest, Heidi, Samir, Yana, Orin, Letta, Stuart and Grant, thanks for all your help. And so with that, I will get into it. So firstly, what are social impact bonds? So they're a type of payment by results financing model for social welfare services, where investors, that's on the left-hand side of the diagram, provide working capital upfront to NGOs, so those are the service providers in the top, and they deliver welfare services to typically vulnerable populations. If the NGO successfully meets predefined outcome targets, so for example, let's say that in the beginning it's agreed that the NGO needs to provide or to place 100 unemployed people into jobs. If the service provider manages to do that, then the outcome funders, so that's the green box, they will repay the investors for the money that they provided to the service provider at the beginning. Outcome funders in SIBs are usually, well, they're always government departments, sometimes with the additional involvement of donors like aid agencies or philanthropic foundations like the Tutuwa Foundation. If the NGO, the service provider, is not successful, so if they don't meet the target of placing that set number of people into jobs, then the outcome funders don't pay. And investors don't earn returns on their investments, and they might also not get their capital back. That just depends on the extent to which there was failure against those performance targets. That performance is audited by an outcome auditor, that circle on the left-hand side at the bottom, and the finances by the financial auditor. And then right at the middle, at the center of these transactions, are intermediaries. And these are typically NPCs that manage the relationships between all of the different stakeholders, participants, and also assist the service providers in doing things like developing results-based systems. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've added a simplified version of the conceptual framework that is in our reports. So I developed these after looking at the international literature on social impact bonds. And what this framework does is it gives us an idea, basically, of how these things are supposed to work based on how they have unfolded elsewhere. So firstly, SIBs focus on outcomes, right? So you agree up front that there's certain targets that need to be met. And what that does is it leads to more effective services, because the SIB structure makes sure that the service provider / NGO, that their number one priority is meeting the performance targets, like the job numbers or improving preschool age children's early learning capabilities. So that's the number one priority. Also, because you have to measure these outcomes, this increases the evidence base about what works in social welfare programming. And in the longer term, with more evidence, you can start to redirect public resources like tax funds, but also private resources like philanthropy and impact investments to where they will have the most impact, rather than spending over and over on the same types of interventions that don't work. Secondly, governance can be challenging. And that's because, as we saw in the previous slide, there are lots of different people involved in these things. So intermediaries have a lot of work to do in managing those relationships. And before that, so before the SIB even gets started, contracting can be lengthy and quite messy. Getting everyone to agree on the investment structuring, also on what kind of targets will be put in place, that can be difficult. But a benefit, despite that difficulty, a benefit of the structure is that you have that intermediary at the center who enhances the rigor in service delivery, and that helps them to gear up for the outcome focus. And the intermediary builds the capacities of the service providers, for example, by introducing new M&E systems. Thirdly, in SIBs, there are changes to the balance of risk in service delivery. So if the SIB doesn't meet its targets, investors lose, not government or service providers. So in other results-based models, like results-based aid, which has become quite popular in recent years, NGOs are only paid if they meet the social targets. But in SIBs, investors come in at the beginning and provide this working capital before any service delivery happens. And what that means is that the NGOs don't have to worry about financial stuff, and they can focus solely on doing what needs to be done operationally to meet the targets. And I think in South Africa, this is quite important because many NGOs provide critical services and operate on small budgets. The results focus can also be freeing for NGOs. So without having to worry about tracking inputs or raising funds, they can try new things and experiment. And that's also useful in areas like employability programming, and early learning, which were the two areas of the SIBs in South Africa, where we've seen over many years that lots of different things have failed, and we need to try new things. And in addition, governments only pay for successful services, so there could be fiscal savings. So remember, governments serve as outcome funders, and they will only pay the investors back if the services are successful and the targets are met. But there is a risk of impact washing, which is when you overstate achievements or misleadingly claim success. And that's because you have it's structured around results. So there is a motivation to kind of overstate those things. And that has been found in some SIBs in other countries. And finally, additionality. So what this means is that SIBs could bring additional money into social service delivery because of the presence of investors, and also the results focus and the that room for kind of experimentation that I talked about could also lead to additional social outcomes, which might not have happened in the absence of the SIB. Next slide, please. So this is the context of the first SIB. So this is the context within which Bonds for Jobs was implemented. So what this graph shows is youth unemployment in South Africa. So we took unemployment data from the last 20 years, and this is what it looks like. And it's bad. Like that's the summary of that slide. Don't really need to say much about it. It's been remarkably stable over the last 20 years. So we've got that third line in the middle, the red one, shows the average unemployment rate for 15 to 34-year-olds. And it's hovered around 50% for 20 years. We see even before COVID, so in 2019, it was already starting to increase. And that's just broader negative economic trends that were buttressing that. And this is the expanded unemployment rate, right? So it includes, it's everyone who's in the labor market and includes people who have stopped looking in the past 4 weeks because they've become discouraged. So next slide, please. So that unemployment is despite really massive spending on education by the public and private sectors. Despite all of that money that's going into education, we still find so many young people can't find work. So the Inclusive Youth Employment Pay for Performance platform, also known as Bonds for Jobs, was the first SIB to be implemented in South Africa, or on the whole continent. And its objectives were to try and turn around the situation, or to get started on turning that situation around. So the first objective was to expand demand-based learning, which simply means designing skills training for unemployed people in collaboration with employers, so the people that demand skills. So criticism of the bulk of training for unemployed people that happens in South Africa is that it's kind of done in an almost blind way to market needs. So you go in as an educational institution and you have ideas about what people need to be successful without necessarily having firm data to tell you, well, actually, these are the employers in this sector, and this is the exact skills that they need. So Bonds for Jobs said we'll have a very clear focus on collaborating with employers and making sure that the skills are what they need. And the service provider on this SIB was Harambee, which has been doing this kind of thing for a long time before joining the SIB in Bonds for Jobs. The other objectives were to bring more private investment into employability training and improve the use of existing money. So lots of money here already. Let's improve the way it's spent and make it more effective, make sure more people get jobs. And then finally, ensure that service providers are results oriented. So there's wider work that's being done in trying to get other NGOs to also adopt that demand-based approach and to focus more on service effectiveness. That table there shows you the targets and the performance against them in this SIB. So the target was just placements and placement into a job. And to qualify as a placement, the person had to be previously unemployed, had to have a contract of at least a year, be a young person aged 18 to 35, go through a training program, and also be able to be reasonably classified as someone who is economically excluded. So, for example, went to a poor school or coming from a family that receives, where someone receives a social grant. And so these were the targets. In the first year, the target was 600. They achieved that target. In year 2, the target was 1,400 placements. And actual placements were 1,209. And that underperformance there is because of COVID. So year 2 ended right in the middle of that first really hard lockdown when basically the entire economy had been shut down. So that's the reason why it was difficult to fill in that last small gap in the placements. COVID also meant that this SIB terminated early. So it had been planned to run for 4 years. It ended after 2. The intermediaries on this SIB decided it would be better to close the SIB early rather than expect that during this kind of economic catastrophe that it would be realistic to expect that we'd still be able to make placements. The financial performance was great. So investors had their investments paid back, so they achieved full capital repayment and also full interest on those investments. And the range was between 7 and 11%, depending on the profile of the investor. So we'll get to that later, but there were different profiles with different terms. Next slide, please. So this is the context of the second SIB, the Impact Bond Innovation Fund, or IBIF. So this was the focus of the SIB is early learning. And more than a third of South African children who are aged 3 to 5 don't attend an early learning program. And cost is a major barrier to access here. So a lot of kind of preschool education is private and it's difficult for people to afford. It's not fully publicly subsidized either. Government also underspends on this sector of education compared to, for example, primary schooling and especially university education and tertiary level, where the government spends a lot more. So that's the first issue, right? So there's more than a third aren't in any early learning program. But another problem is that of the people who are in early learning, of these children that do attend, so Ilifa Labantwana is a big collective of ECD organizations, and they estimate that half of 3 to 4-year-olds are receiving low quality services, even if they have been able to access them. So this matters because if you don't have a good early learning foundation, you start formal schooling at a disadvantage relative to other kids who have had good early learning service provided to them. And so you progress through primary schooling slower and later schooling as well. It also matters not just kind of from educational achievement, but from a social and behavioral perspective. And so from a very early age, so from the time we are 5 years old, the population is kind of segmenting, and this is reinforcing inequalities that last throughout the lifetime. And it's not kind of unreasonable to expect that the unemployment problems that we're seeing relate to this as well. Next slide, please. So this is what the IBIF, the context that they set up in. So their objectives were to expand access to early learning and to ensure not only access, but quality as well. And that quality would be achieved through the SIB instrument. So having an outcome focus, measuring outcomes and making use of the ELOM, which is the early learning outcome measure. And that would be used to measure the quality of the services provided. So the ELOM measures, I'm just going to read this, what children of particular ages and stages should know and be able to do. And it's a 45-minute test that covers things like gross motor development, fine motor coordination, emerging numeracy and mathematics cognition, etc. So this was going to be used to test if the services were any good. Also, access would be expanded by delivering these services not in a school setting where you have to go to like a building and school, but there would be people would come into your house and provide the services to children and their caregivers in their homes. So that solves the issue of the difficulty in cost of going to a school. And then also to increase collaboration in early learning delivery. So the SIB, you've got lots of different actors, so you all work together, hope for better outcomes. The targets, so the target was to enroll 2,000 children and deliver them with these services in their homes and to their caregivers. And they vastly exceeded that target. So they reached double the number. And then on the early learning outcomes measure, the aim or the target was to achieve improvement in the average test score. So remember, I said that this ELOM is a test and you deliver it, and each child was tested after a year in the program. So to get an average improvement in the kind of class score, and the performance against that, so they did achieve an improvement, but it wasn't enough. So it wasn't the same amount as what had been targeted or agreed upon upfront. And so because of that underperformance on that target, that affected the financial performance, but only marginally. So there was investors got their capital back, and with 14% annual interest payments against a maximum of 16. So that was the maximum that they could have earned, that 2% shortfall due to that slight underperformance on the ELOM. And yeah, there were various reasons for that underperformance, mostly the fact that the ELOM is a very new measure, a new test. It had never been used prior to the IBIF. But please read the reports for more details about that. Next slide, please. Right, so this is just a summary of the findings, and by and large, both SIBs worked as intended based on the conceptual framework that I outlined a couple of slides ago. So for example, having the output targets rallied the NGOs to improve delivery and ensure the targets were met. Intermediaries helped them to do that. There's also evidence now about what works in early learning and in youth employability, and that is starting to change the way that government departments are delivering this program, this type of programming outside of the SIBs. An interesting finding on Bonds for Jobs was that they used a blended capital stack to attract commercial investors, and this brought in additional money into the fight against unemployment. One area where they didn't necessarily work as expected is in the risk distribution. So we find that the risk sharing wasn't as shared as it could have been across the different stakeholders. There isn't evidence of impact washing. So where service providers and intermediaries overstated success, or like chose to work with people who maybe didn't need the services and who would have easily succeeded anyway. And that's actually something that's quite common in employment training programs in other countries. But the targets could have been more ambitious, we think. So we think that in the IBIF, a greater portion of the outcome payments could have been linked to that difficult ELOM measure. And in bonds for jobs, perhaps the placement numbers could have been higher. Obviously, COVID would have made that impossible anyway, but I mean, these were set prior to that. And that's it from me for now. So that's a very kind of quick view of the work. So please read the reports. Thanks.
Zoheb, thank you very much for that very interesting outline of a very big research project on two of the social impact bonds in South Africa. I think a lot of detail in the report, so folks, we would certainly encourage you to read the detail there. Zoheb, if you stay with us for just a moment, we've got some questions from the Q&A that I would like to pose to you, please. First one that I've picked up here from Zahida Valley. The question to you is, how different are SIBs to outcomes-based contracting?
So SIBs are a type of outcome-based contract, but the major difference with other types of outcome-based contracts is that shifting of the risk. So it's investors come in SIBs, and they provide the NGO service provider with the money at the beginning, before they deliver any services. In other outcomes-based contracts, what you will typically find, so for example, with aid agencies who have results-based contracts with countries, for example, or with NGOs in developing countries, if the performance fails, so if there's like a job program and they don't meet the job targets, then those NGOs don't get paid. And so they suffer losses. In SIBs, that doesn't happen because investors come in and give the money at the beginning. So I guess that's the major difference.
Thank you, Zoheb. A next question from an anonymous attendee. If the investors are reimbursed by government, does it still not really solve the problem since the government purse is limited? I think a very interesting question.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think, so across many of the interviews, a common feeling I found was a sort of unease about using public money to repay investors. But the idea is that in the SIBs, you're testing out new ways of doing things. So with bonds for jobs, for example, it's an experiment really with this demand-based training model to see if you do employment services in a new way, will they work? With the IBIF, it was, if we expand early learning in people's homes and we use this new test, can we achieve success? And remember, this is against a background where government's been spending billions on these things for decades without achieving enough success. So if we can find what works, then the idea is you change the way that government spends money. And so in the longer term, government saves, right? Because they're not spending on ineffective programming anymore.
Thank you, Zoheb. And one last question before we move on to the panel. Folks, thank you for posting those questions. Just a reminder to all the attendees that the QA area is open. Please post your questions there. There have been some very fascinating questions. And if your question hasn't been asked, it's maybe because I'm holding it back because I think it's more relevant for the panel. But here's a final one, Zoheb, that I think you might be able to shed some light on. And this question comes from Harsha Desai. What have we learned about target setting in this process? And what can you share with us in terms of your observations about the expected outcomes versus actual results?
Okay, so I think in both SIBs, setting the targets was difficult. So, for example, in Bonds for Jobs, there was a very extensive process, negotiation around making sure that the targets that they were targeting the right people. And so there was a long process of making sure that they got the right kind of indicators built in. So the things I mentioned about so indicators of disadvantage. So what is that? If you're delivering services to the unemployed, it needs to be people who are struggling, who would struggle to find a job in the absence of your programming, right? So it's people, for example, who've been to low-income schools, or people who have who come from families that can't afford kind of expensive private education. So building those kinds of indicators and targets. And on the IBIF, there was a lot of difficulty in agreeing on the outcome measure. So that ELOM measure that I talked about, that's something that's never been used before. And a lot of the standards for assessing early learning come from the global north. So they're developed in Europe and North America, where kind of context is very different. So they don't really apply for South African children. So those kinds of things were complex. And then also in the performance against those targets. So with Bonds for Jobs, like we saw what happened with COVID. So you can set targets for jobs and think that those are kind of easily achievable. But then something totally unexpected like COVID can come into the picture and mess everything up. On the IBIF as well, there was also difficulty from COVID, but there, and we do discuss this in the report, they managed to continue delivery despite COVID. And I guess the last thing to say about that was there was also difficulty on the IBIF with just with the ELOM testing, and the report goes into more detail about that.
Zoheb, thank you. I'd like us to move on to the panel discussion now. So please stay, obviously you're staying around. Zoheb will be able to field any more questions if there are any additional ones directed to him. So he's not leaving us, but I would like to move on to our panel discussion now. So if I can ask our panelists to please turn on their cameras and their audio as we get into some introductions from you. And I'm going to do the introductions as follows. We'll ask a specific question to each of the panelists, and that question will give us a view on what their participation was about, and also help us to learn exactly some of the insights of what you've perceived and what you've learned in the process. Kasturi Soni, if I can start with you, welcome. You join us from the Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. The accelerator played a key role in the SIB, and Harambee in particular was the technical intermediary on the Bond for Jobs. This was certainly Harambee's first participation in the SIB, but Harambee's always had a strong outcome focus. How was the participation for Harambee different from other work that you've done in the past? And from your experience with all of this outcome focus, have you seen a different level of efficacy of the SIB?
Thank you, Grant. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kasturi. I'm the Financial Director at Harambee. And firstly, let me thank Tutuwa Foundation and Intellidex for providing me with the opportunity to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. I had the privilege of being part of the team that incubated and piloted the Bonds for Jobs SIB. And Harambee is a not-for-profit social enterprise that partners with other organizations to build innovations and solutions to address youth unemployment. Harambee's participation in the Bonds for Jobs SIB was in the context of Harambee transitioning from being purely an operator to being an ecosystem enabler in the youth employment space. So Harambee played the role of technical intermediary and bonds for jobs played the role of financial intermediary. One of the key objectives of our SIB was to create a demonstration effect for shifting the skills funding in the ecosystem from funding purely input-based skills interventions that had low throughput and conversion rates to funding more performance-based outcomes that would enable the transition of unemployed youth into the economy. So the focus was to develop the SIB as a financial instrument for funding inclusive youth employment. Therefore, it wasn't only about Harambie's operational delivery, but more importantly, how could we create a proof point for shifting the broader ecosystem towards funding more impactful outcomes for young people. Also, Harambee wanted to enable and support other operators to deliver and achieve similar outcomes, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about that a bit later. Your question about effectiveness. So with respect to effectiveness, we were able to access capital markets through a compelling value proposition, which essentially demonstrated our outcome, which was inclusive youth employment, as an investable opportunity that had both a financial as well as a social return. We also were able to bring together a coalition of actors from the private sector, public sector, and social sector who could collectively co-finance innovative and cost-effective solutions for inclusive youth employment in a risk-sharing model. We were able to demonstrate all the elements of the mechanics of the actual SIB structure, from intermediating different stakeholder mandates to designing the appropriate legal structures, the contracting, and the flow of funds. And lastly, let me say that in our view, we felt that the transaction costs as well as the speed of incubation of the actual SIB structure were efficient and effective. Let me stop there, Grant.
Kasturi, thank you very much. And I'm going to move swiftly to Joe, who joins us from Volta Capital. Joe De Silvio, welcome. So Volta was the financial intermediary on the IBIF, but you've also participated in a range of SIBs around the world. Can you share with us a little bit of your experience and a bit of a reflection on how your experience differed, maybe in the South African context, or where you saw major similarities? Over to you, Joe, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. As Grant said, I'm Joe De Silvio. I'm Impact and Performance Manager at Volta Capital. And Volta is a development finance impact investing advisory firm. And as was said, we have worked at a number of SIBs and DIBs, and I'll discuss the distinction there in a second. Around the world on IBIF, we worked very closely with our partner, Mothers to Mothers, who I know some people from Mothers to Mothers are in the audience here. And together we kind of played the coordinating role, intermediary, stakeholder management, capacity building, all these different things, which we can get into what kind of an intermediary does. But another bond where we play a similar role, where we help to structure it, get it off the ground, and go into performance is in Cameroon. It's called the Cameroon Cataract Bond, which is focused on providing high quality cataract surgeries to prevent avoidable blindness over a 5-year period. We're about halfway through on that one. So we play a similar role there. I think it's important to note that there's, first of all, quite a lot of differences between the two contexts and the two structures themselves. And I think you'll find this if you look at even across Bond for Jobs and IBIF, for example, every bond has been very bespoke to date around the world. And I think just to put this in a bigger context, there's been a little under 200 impact bonds to date, right? Only 17 of those have been in lower middle income countries. And only, as far as I know, 3, including these 2, were actually SIBs, social impact bonds, where a government is one of the outcome funders. The distinction with the Cameroon case is it's a DIB actually, which is a development impact bond. The only difference is there's not a government involved. It's a private donor, foundation, et cetera, that provides the outcome funding. So that seems like it's maybe a small distinction, but it actually makes quite a big difference in the kind of constellation of stakeholders involved, in the structure of it, et cetera. So I think that's like one thing to keep in mind, is that's a difference you'll see when you're looking at impact bonds. The structure's the same, but that who's paying for what can make things change quite a bit. In terms of the context and the kind of a bigger picture of this, there was quite a big difference between IBIF and this other context. In terms of the example of IBIF was an ECD intervention that on its own was not an investable model, right? It required grant funding. It's serving low-income populations that aren't paying for services. Government was providing finance to it before this. And so this was a way, bringing investors in was a way to share risk, all these things that Zoheb outlined earlier, and let the government understand what works best, right? Whereas the cataract bond technically is an investable model because it's a private eye hospital that's providing cataract surgeries that generates revenue. It has full paying patients that then cross-subsidize its free and subsidized work for lower income ones. So the reason we used a DIB in that case was totally different. The reason was no one would invest in it because it was a startup in Cameroon, and therefore it was determined to be too risky and no one wanted to invest in it. So we needed that risk sharing component, component, et cetera. And so at the end of the day, kind of the ultimate goal is different between these two, and you can see this in different bonds, whereas IBIF, for example, or Bond for Jobs is trying to convince government what is the best use of their money. Is this a good way to spend your money down the road, and inform that? Whereas in the future, scaling and replication for something like the cataract bond would be, maybe you don't need a DIB at all and you just need private investors to come in now that they've seen the model works there and they can just invest directly. And I think like part of like what we're trying to do with IBIF 1, it was quite a small intervention as Zoheb outlined. And what we're trying to do now is think about a second round of a results-based financing mechanism for ECD in the South African context, which happy to talk about later, but to really test what this looks like on a bigger scale with multiple kind of intervention models and rigorously get that evidence base that would be needed for then the government to be able to say, here are the things that are best value for money and pick it up from there. So I'll pause there, but those are a few of the differences we've seen.
Joe, thank you. I'm sure we'll pick up a few more questions from the participants in the audience as well. Maybe some insights that can help us expand from your learning as well. I'd like to introduce Nafisa Rabini, who joins us from the Western Cape Foundation for Community Work. Nafisa, welcome. So you're from the Foundation of Community Work in the Western Cape, and your organization has been around for a very long time. So what were the benefits of participating in the SIB, and what was interesting for you?
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thanks, Grant, and thanks for the opportunity to share on here. Just to say that FCW has been around for 46 years, older than I am. So we've been in the field of early childhood development, running our family focus program. What the SIB provided us was definitely a growth and learning opportunity for the organization. I think our end goal is always to ensure that our participants, the families, and the children get the quality services that they deserve. So some key lessons for us that we got from the Impact Bond project was we were able to employ skilled staff, specifically M&E, for the rigorous outcomes and reporting that was due, as well as a project manager specific to this project. We had strengthened M&E and technological capacity within FCW on all levels, and I'm talking about from management right across to the field workers, which was fantastic to see. We moved from a paper-based data collection tool to a digital platform, an app known as Ulwazi. The data collection and verification capacity of the field staff improved. They often took data presented to them that was in it, so that was fun to watch. Obviously resulting in an overall improvement in the accuracy of the records that we had. Enhancement communication between field staff and project staff, because all staff now have devices, which was something we didn't have before. We introduced an incentive scheme for home visitors in the project. So traditionally, they would get X amount within our normal FI program. I think what IBIF presented was an opportunity to slightly increase and make it more attractive for the home visitors to ensure that they actually firstly stayed in the program, and also ensured that they understood the outcomes and worked towards achieving that. They felt valued and appreciated because of this. The entire team became data-driven, and we use this as eventually NGOs just keep doing a lot more of what they used to. What the Impact Bond project provided was an opportunity to streamline and strengthen the work that we were doing. So that was fantastic to see. We had monthly incentives built in for the caregivers and the children as well. So they would attend a home visit 4 times a month. And at the end of the month, they'd receive a toy or a pack of crayons or something to keep them, to retain them firstly, but also to provide the resources needed to continue with ECD activities in the absence of the home visit. So this was because these home visitors come from communities that are rife in social ills, gangsterism, abuse, gender-based violence, and they come from the communities within which they work. The need for psychosocial support for them was very important, and we saw this coming through very strongly. And we were able to actually develop a psychosocial workshop plan that we implemented for this project as well. The early learning outcome measures, I think Zoheb mentioned about that earlier on. You guys can go and read up some more about that. I think what was good, even though we didn't achieve the target, was that we did see a marked difference between the first year and the second year. I think when COVID hit, unfortunately, we were stopped in our tracks to actually try and do a third one, even though it wasn't expected of us, but we would have liked to see another jump, an improvement in terms of the quality of the program that we presented. And then I think the one important thing, our outcome auditors development works, they reported in their findings, and I'm quoting here directly from them: M&E has been embedded into the DNA of FCW. There are good prospects for maintaining and building on M&E gains made as a result of IBIF. And I think definitely sticks or holds through for FCW because we've grown in leaps and bounds since. Maybe touch base a bit more about that later in terms of what our plans are going forward as well.
Wonderful.
So thanks, Graunt.
Nafisa, thank you. I'm going to ask you to turn off your video, because I think your audio quality was suffering a little bit there. But we'll keep you on. If you just stay on audio, I think we'll be able to improve that. Let me move swiftly to introduce Nazim Hendricks, who joins us from the Jobs Fund. Nazim, we're all very curious about why the Jobs Fund was interested in the Bond for Jobs. Can you tell us about what the reasoning was for your participation?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Well, the Jobs Fund was conceptualized and then capitalized in 2011 to really pilot innovative job creation models. We do so within a challenge fund, or on challenge fund principles. When we received this application from Harambee, Kasturi spoke about it earlier, what really attracted us to it was that innovation. It was really the first SIB to go to contracting. There was one under negotiation at that point, but it never contracted. So we were interested in looking at this new innovative, new, almost novel funding mechanism. I'm hesitant to say model. I would rather say funding mechanism, because the underlying operator is the model. And the SIB is really the overlay, the funding overlay on that model. The second issue was, of course, it became very attractive and competitive within the challenge fund perspective, because we were only funding based on pre-agreed outcomes being achieved. So that reduced the Jobs Fund grant risk, and that made the program a lot more attractive. I think two things that wasn't necessarily evident at the time when we assessed that program. The first one is the level of innovation that the SIB would bring, because the operators are incentivized to innovate so that they can generate more cash flow from the project. Because if a job is going to cost you 30,000, you're receiving 30,000. It's up to you to innovate, to actually do it in a better way and cheaper, to be able to have more cash flows. And then the fourth one was, and I think Kasturi mentioned it as well, we were looking to widen the base of the operators in the market. Yes, we have significant players, large players like Harambee in the market, and a number of others. But if you really look at the overall market, there's not sufficient capacity at the moment to actually attract and help all of the young people that we need to get to in various regions of Africa. And a big part of this project was actually capacitating and incubating that additional capacity into the market. So that, in short, were the four key things that we looked at in approving this project.
Nazim, thank you. I think that was very fascinating, and likely there are going to be questions coming to you from the Q&A as well. So thanks very much. And thank you for joining us. Justin Przeski, hello. We've known each other for a while. You're from Standard Bank Tutuwa Community Foundation. And what's interesting about the foundation is that you participated in both SIBs. What do you think was the biggest difference between the SIBs, and what did you learn from participating in them?
Graunt, hi, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and to the fellow panelists and indeed the audience. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, indeed we did. I think in Zoheb's introduction, the obvious differences between the two bonds have come out. One was at early childhood, the other much later in the youth life spectrum, if I can put it that way. And clearly there's a difference in scale, in financial quantum. Again, the earlier slides talked to that. But I guess the biggest difference then came to the fact that as investors, in the first, if we were essentially all lined up the same, taking pretty much the same amount of capital going in, the same level of risk. Whereas with bonds for jobs, the blended capital stack concept was introduced. And Nazim was talking about this idea of innovation. And so there we saw an innovative model, innovating further, whereby we had an investor who wanted a capital guarantee. We had commercial investors, and then Tutuwa coming in as what we call the first loss investor in this case. And so that was probably the biggest difference between the two. If I can flip it around a bit for a second, Grant, the interesting thing about the similarities of the two processes was probably the fact that just how interested the various role players were in making these work. I think you saw that from the early design work, and Kasturi was talking about the time taken to get this going, to role players being prepared to try different things, to really find something that perhaps in a more commercial negotiation between funders and borrowers, you wouldn't necessarily see. The idea of quite a lot of not just win-win coming out, but almost give, I think was something that really stood out for me. And that philosophy played itself out during both bonds' lifespan too, when the inevitable challenges came along of stuff that you can't anticipate when you're contracting. How did we collectively come to deal with those problems? And I think you saw a lot of that give mentality coming through to both. I'll stop there.
Justin, thank you. I'm sure there's a lot more to say, but thank you for that brief introduction. Thanks very much. Last but certainly not least, TJ Tapela joins us from Brimstone. You were a commercially oriented investor in the SIB. Why did you decide to participate in this piece of innovation, if you like, and something that is kind of, has the blended outcome of finance and the social outcomes that we expect? TJ, can you share some experiences and insights from your perspective? TJ, you're muted. There we go.
I had to be the first one who gets told to unmute, right? Sorry.
There's always someone.
Grant. Yeah, thanks, Grant. As you said, my name is TJ Tapela, and I'm a managing executive at Brimstone. This is what is traditionally called a Black empowerment company. It's actually an investment business, a listed investment business. And as part of creating a legacy from some of the opportunities that we've enjoyed in our 25 years in business, created a fund which is called the Brimstone Legacy Fund, which has investment partners in it, namely Old Mutual and Nedbank, and as equal funding partners. It's just I run it from a Brimstone point of view. So when we talk about Brimstone here, we're actually talking about the Brimstone Legacy Fund. And so the Brimstone Legacy Fund's mandate is the youth, job creation, and helping young entrepreneurs, particularly women in the peri-urban, basically poorer areas. So when Bonds for Jobs came along, for us, it like really hit the sweet spot, because the legacy fund is a patient capital funder, so doesn't have demanding funding rates. Basically, it's a capital preservation that we seek, and Bonds for Jobs ticked that. Job creation ticked that with the first pilot 600 jobs amongst the youth, ticked that. Youth from poor backgrounds, ticked that. So everything was perfect for us, including, as I said, the capital protection. And what was especially more exciting for us, that we're an operating partner, a technical partner in Harambee, who kind of like had a demonstrated track record in this area, but also was going to innovate further by being able to put together like 20 partners. I mean, there were essentially 20 partner groups in this. When your audience looks at the report and they look at the chart for Bonds for Jobs, you just see how scary it actually looks, and yet how simply it was put together. And so for us, for me personally, and for Brimstone, if you ask us what our biggest clear impact of COVID was, it would be our disappointment in having to abandon the second phase of this. But yeah, I'll stop there.
TJ, thank you. And I think this next question from our audience is probably going to give you a chance to expand a little bit more on your thinking as well. So let me just read that question. It's apparent to everyone that social needs are vast and ever growing, and we need private capital to begin to meet some of those needs. How do we ensure that maybe mechanisms like this brings private capital to the table at a much greater scale? So TJ, if I can start with you, and other panelists, perhaps you can share some thoughts on what your experience was in terms of the idea of how to use private capital to solve social problems, and how we use this kind of learning from these SIBs now to attract more and more funding, and particularly private capital, into these mechanisms. But let me start that question with TJ.
Okay, thanks, Graunt, and thanks for that. It's a great question. I would say that this is where the need for the kind of patient capital, like I described the Brimstone Legacy Fund to be, is where it's crucial, because it literally bridges the gap between, in this case, let's say, from a capital structuring and the blending of capital, is really perfect for a fund like ours, where capital preservation was important and with the protection of the first loss funders, but our participation enabled the more commercial funders, the senior lenders, to actually come in and basically make this project fundable from a pure commercial point of view, which is so that blend of private capital between some kind of patient capital that comes in to enable more commercial funding to participate, I think is quite key, because often even the ultimate beneficiaries of this initiative like this aren't able to, and we've seen it in other areas that we fund in this kind of social transformation angle, that you need an enabler, which is not necessarily always just grant funding or pure philanthropy. There's a layer that is required there to make more commercial funding. And I think the commercial funder comes in and almost literally becomes your test of sustainability. I mean, that's kind of my take on it.
I think that's a lovely thought that we need to hold on to. The commercial fund is your test for sustainability. I really like that idea, TJ. Let me ask Justin to jump in. Justin, because in your opening statement as well, you mentioned a whole lot of ideas around being a first loss investor, the role of Tutuwa in the project. So let me just get you to share some views on that same question and perhaps reflect on some of TJ's comments as well.
Yeah, Grant, thanks. And I think TJ really summarized the roles of the different providers of capital, those with different risk return expectations really nicely there. And I see there was a question in the chat, I think, about in the Q&A about what can traditional organizations like trusts do? And perhaps many people feel that their mandates preclude them from structures like this. And maybe to be a little provocative to say, look, challenge that. I think there's a Brazilian politician and Harvard professor called Roberto Ungro who says that too many people in the world suffer from this tyranny of no alternatives. And I think structures like this are social experiments to try and break this. And where foundations can come in, there are costs to pay in these things. You may not feel you could invest, you may not have the mandate to invest to get your return, or the possibility of a return, I should say, in this case. But there are, and again, this was another question I saw, that yes, to get legal fees in, to bring the design piece in, does require an investment from someone. And these are bespoke instruments. And so there are roles for foundations there. You may not feel that, you are capable of getting an investment through your decision-making structures, but you could probably get a grant through that would fund something like this. And so that's, I think, a real opportunity for organizations in that space to come in. We, just to bring it back to Tutuwa for a brief moment, we had the mandate to try new things and to try and develop pioneering financing solutions was one of these opportunities that we couldn't pass up. Irrespective of the outcome, we were prepared to almost treat it like a grant and not see any money coming back. But as Kasturi said, use the demonstration opportunity to show the country and indeed the world of what these things can do, good or bad.
Yeah. Kasturi, that was a great segue from did you just raise your hand? I was just coming to you. I'd love to hear from your perspective, Kasturi, and Joe, maybe after Kasturi, in terms of being able to attract commercial investors. Tell us about that experience. Kasturi, I hope that's going to be the point that you pick up, because that certainly was the question in my mind.
I can certainly weave it into what I was going to say, but maybe just to add to TJ's and Justin's points, I think if I look at it from an outcomes funder perspective, the effect of having a blended capital stack meant that we could have a cost of capital that was more acceptable to our outcomes funders. And I think that's also a key point to remember. And then I can weave in your question. I think that what we were trying to do was really something new. It was an imperfect solution. We did not have the answers to all the questions. We certainly didn't know what we didn't know. And to pick up on Justin's point about a give-give approach, I think an important contribution is having early adopter partners who are on the journey with you of co-creating a solution. And that means that you're going to learn together, you're going to problem solve together. And we created specific spaces for that to enable that. And I think that's a very important contribution to highlight. With respect to securing investors, well, what can I say? That certainly was an iterative process of negotiation, which certainly wasn't a science, it was an art. And it was actually led by my colleagues at Bonds for Jobs, because they played the role of financial intermediary. And like you've heard, we've had different investors with different mandates, different risk appetites, depending on whether you are capital preservation, first loss, or a commercial provider of capital. And so I guess just highlighting again the very important role of intermediation. And as you've heard several times, we were eventually able to land on a blended capital stack, which provided a cost of capital that was very amenable and acceptable to our outcomes funders. Thanks.
Thank you, Kasturi. Joe, do you have any thoughts to share on that, and in particular this question about the commercial investors?
Yeah, sure. A couple of thoughts here, and I agree with everything that's been said, so I won't reiterate any of that. But I think one thing that keeps coming up here is these are bespoke instruments, right? This is part of, I think, one of the hurdles is that at these initial round, there's a lot of educating to do. Like, what is this thing even? Why is this useful, who should get involved, all of that. I think part of what's going to get new people involved and get more and more types of commercial investors, for example, involved in these, is just creating more of a marketplace for this, right? Where you have a more standardized approach where you can, like in the UK, for example, they've done enough of these where you can say, oh, we actually do have a pretty good catalog of like how to price outcomes and a bunch of different interventions that have tried this. So we kind of know the legal regulatory framework we need to deal with, how you count for this, all these different things. Whereas in the South African context, it's still brand new, and these are two completely different examples. So I think that's going to be part of it. I think from our perspective in terms, and I think we're right to say that to date, most of the investors that come into this are like very much in the impact investing camp or foundations that are investing into this space. So not your normal commercial investors. And if we did have three, and much like Bond for Jobs, we did have a range of different investors, one of which was Future Growth, which is a commercial investor, institutional investor that we had to, there was a different negotiation process that took longer there. But I think having Tutuwa involved, for example, helped to facilitate that. And I think it was just an interesting kind of like way to bring someone in. I think if we wanted to do this doing this in the future, we need to make the case that this is like a robust market. It's much more streamlined to do this. It's demystified, and there's like good avenues, not to mention all the discussion about the capital stack that we could discuss as well. But that's a few thoughts there.
Joe, thank you for sharing those ideas. Folks, we are coming towards the end of our discussion now. I see Zanele has got her hand raised, and I think she probably wants to make a comment as well about this particular question, but this also is a good point for me to introduce Zanele again to you, who is the CEO of the Standard Bank Tutuwa Community Foundation and a key funder of the SIBs, as we've mentioned before, but also a supporter of the research. So I'd like to hand over to Zanele right now to deliver some closing remarks. Let me say thank you to the folks who posted questions. I apologize always that we didn't get to all the questions. They were super fascinating. I was monitoring them and holding them for the panel, but we haven't been able to address all of them. If at all possible, we may be able to get you some answers in the chat. I'll ask our moderators to take a look at those. And if there's anything specific that they can give you in that chat, they'll do that right now. But let me now just hand over to Zanele Twala, who will do some closing remarks for us, and then I'll come back and say our final goodbyes. Zanele, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Graunt. Just before I do the closing remarks, I think the one thing that I wanted to add to what Justin said in terms of the opportunity we had to try new things was that as a nonprofit company as well, we were afforded the opportunity to really push the envelope, because I think quite often we look at our regulatory structures, our mandates, and the way that we are set up, and we somehow feel we're limited. I mean, our tax exemption status, and therefore are not able to get into the investment space. So I think this is also partly to challenge nonprofit organizations in South Africa to look at their designs and see if they can't engage in something like this, which involves private capital, but also to crowd in government or outcome funders. Okay, having said that, I think before I pass a vote of thanks, I just wanted to make the following remarks in terms of why we participated in the SIBs. And we are one of the investors that's in a unique situation where we participated in both SIBs. Our strategy and our strategic focus as a foundation allowed us to do that, because we do focus on young people from their earliest years through to post-schooling, and therefore the Bond for Jobs in the employment creation space also allowed us to do that. There are a number of reasons. I think some of them are that the innovations both address the pressing need for social upliftment, I think they also bring together private finance and social organizations that provide outsourced public services. And we know that this is an area where government has always struggled, particularly in terms of quality public services. So in this way, we could show that quality services could be offered. And I think the actual SIBs processes, they demand quality social outcomes with evidence that funding has been efficiently utilized and public benefit outcomes are achieved. So even the private sector rigor is introduced, to achieve governmental priorities. And I think in the case of Bond for Jobs, we know that employing young people who otherwise would not have had jobs and addressing skills scarcity at an entry level also meets the national interest need. So hence our participation. We just also feel that such processes also cement the relationships between the public and private sectors. And I think it ensures that each role player participates in their area of expertise while they're being able to contribute in sectors outside their core businesses. And I think for us as a foundation, while the main objective of our involvement in the SIB was not because we were seeking a financial return for our investment, we welcomed the financial return. And we could reinvest that money, if not in the same initiatives, in other social initiatives. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a grant where sometimes we don't even get a financial return, but nevertheless, maybe a social outcome return. I think also being that these are real-time solutions, it's quite an attractive, it was quite attractive for us. And while social impact bonds have quantified predetermined outcomes for every young person placed in a job for the first time, the wider impact is really immeasurable. I think one of the things that was reflected in the reports is that if you had to do an impact evaluation, which the auditors, performance auditors do not do, you'll actually find there's a lot we have changed in families where these young people got jobs and they were able to feed a family, and equally in their homes where services were offered for early childhood. I mean, lastly, I think the incentives in terms of why we got involved for participating was that, each organization in this bond initiative, they were all aligned, especially for experiential learning and encouraging all parties to work together, take an innovative approach and quickly determine which interventions are effective and which ones are not. So I just wanted to reflect on that. And the fact that when we commissioned this report, some of the reasons was that we wanted to position ourselves as a thought leader on this topic. We have participated in both bonds. And we know that in the global context, very little is known about social impact bonds, beyond a small number of adopters. So we know that we're offering even the world in terms of some of what we have experimented on. And then the evidence-based policy and investment is also huge in terms of showing that these things can work. We would like to reduce the complexity. I mean, at this stage, it's nice to make it seem like it was a very short process, but really it took us a long time. I mean, 2 years in the making in terms of setup. So those are some of the things you'll find in the report. Then why Intellidex? In terms of who we chose to work with on this one was obviously because of the independence. And that it's really well respected in terms of this area, especially because they are financial capitals markets company. So coming to my vote of thanks, I'd like to thank all the key stakeholders that participated in the SIBs, investors, intermediaries, implementing organizations, even the lawyers that drafted the contracts, because we sat with them endlessly, looking at certain clauses. I can tell you, after the legal agreements that we had to look at some point, I felt like I could have really taken up law. Specifically, the intermediaries, Betha Center, and other intermediaries like we've heard from, for providing the infrastructure support, coordinating all these role players. I mean, these are complex structures. And then implementing organizations as well for ensuring that all the revenue generated from this transaction is spent on the beneficiaries, the poor and disadvantaged, specifically the young people. The teams that supported all of us, the trustees and board of directors of our governing structures, the government, the Jobs Fund, even the Western Cape government, who took this innovative path or journey, could encourage other provinces as well. And Graunt, for doing such a sterling job on your MEC, to our panelists for giving us such an insightful commentary. Last but not least, Zoheb, we know how hard you worked as a lead researcher in this area, often giving you headaches about changing things and consultations with us, even as the IBIF board. And to our combined marketing teams who prepared for this launch, we acknowledge that it wasn't easy. And lastly, to all of you who have joined this launch and for sharing and giving up your time with us. Thank you very much.
Zanele, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Standard Bank Tutuwa Community Foundation for supporting the work and the research and respecting our independence in the process. We truly appreciate that. Folks, we've come to the end of our discussion on these reports now. I would encourage you to please download copies of the reports. Please read them. Let us know what you think. Get in touch. You can reach us on our website. You can reach us through our social media channels. And in particular, allow me to say we have another report coming out which will be of interest, I think, for the community on this call today. It's a review of the renewable energy community trusts, and that report will be coming out early in May. So please keep your eyes out for any information about that. A final word of thanks from me from all our panelists, and to Dr. Zoheb Khan, who did our presentation for us today, and to everyone who dialed in from around the world. Thank you and continue the good work. And I'll sign off now from Intellidex. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.